Let us pray. Dear God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you. Amen. Many of us in our society today love knowledge, don't we? To how many of us is Ken Jennings a familiar name? Long-term Jeopardy champions become famous, and trivia games continue to be very popular. Neighborhoods with good school systems are highly valued, and people are encouraged to get as much education as they will need to pursue their goals. I myself ended up as a chemistry graduate student at Vanderbilt obtaining a PhD because that's what I was going to need to do the kind of work I felt led to do. To my great surprise, this seemed to impress people. So much so that I started trying to avoid sharing what it was I was studying at Vanderbilt with the people at the church, Methodist church across the street that I was attending at the time, because their responses had gotten totally predictable. It was always going to be one of three. Oh my, or you must be smart, or oh my, you must be smart. Little did they know that, at least from my perspective, persistence was a much more valuable attribute for this endeavor than was having smarts. And it also may have been that a piece of Nashville society perhaps still wasn't used to the concept of a young woman wanting to study chemistry. But the idea behind getting that PhD was so that I could get the training and experience I needed to pursue my career goals. It wasn't to impress people. And the same thing can be said for my husband, John, and many other scientists I've encountered in my life. There are some, however, who seem to crave the prestige that can be associated with a higher degree. When John was working at GE's Central R&D facility, for example, one of his coworkers, a fellow PhD, insisted on being referred to as doctor, but also insisted on having doctor embossed on every single one of his credit cards so that he could obtain preferential treatment at restaurants and other establishments. This kind of brought to my mind images of George Whitefield, the contemporary preacher of John Wesley, who was very concerned about the dangers of self-puffery. Now, I'm not in any way trying to denigrate the effort that goes into getting an advanced degree, okay? Because it can take a lot of work. But the question I'm asking is, why are we getting that degree? Is it to make ourselves look good so we can impress others? Or is it so that we can develop a deeper relationship with God as we seek to make a positive difference in God's world? And it doesn't even matter what kind of work we do, right? As long as it's legal, okay? It's really more a function of how we do that work and how we live our lives that matters. Will they know we are Christians by our love? Now, the potential pitfall of self-puffery associated with acquiring knowledge is not just limited to one's career path. What about our spiritual education? Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians that we read a portion of a little while ago, seems to indicate that a similar problem has cropped up. Members of the church in Corinth had been priding themselves on their superior spiritual knowledge compared to some others. They knew that idols had no power. They knew that the one God was the only thing that was really important. And so they could go off and eat food that had been offered to idols without having a problem. They used their privileged information to allow themselves to participate in social occasions where such meat would be available. And so they could fit in with society really well. At the same time, though, there were some other believers, newer believers, who weren't so sure about this meat business. They were concerned that eating meat that had been offered to an idol might tie them in some way to idol worship. And so when they saw these more established Christians eating this meat, they had the potential to be led astray. And Paul is saying to the church in Corinth, what good is all your superior knowledge if you're not using it to look out for and care for these newer believers? Sure, you know that the one God's what's important and that idols don't really mean anything. And you can go eat that meat with a clear conscience. But as you do that, what if you cause one of those newer believers to stumble in their faith? It's not exactly caring for and loving them, is it? As Paul points out, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Paul seemed to be suggesting that perhaps those church members would be better off spending their time caring for and loving those new believers as opposed to focusing on their own superior knowledge and freedom. Now, we see the same kind of conflict today, don't we? Gil Rendell, in his book, Quietly Courageous, Leading the Church in a Changing World, tells us that our society has changed rather significantly, even within our own lifetimes. We've gone from a culture that is convergent, where people come together and work for a common goal, thinking in terms of we, to more of a divergent culture, where individual knowledge and freedom seems to take priority, and people think of themselves as I. Now, interestingly, Gil, in the conference book group discussion about his book, shared with us that actually both the we and the I behaviors are important. We need both of those. And he alluded to Jesus' reminding us about the two most important commandments, that we need to love God, which involves ourselves as individuals deepening our relationship with God as an I, but we also need to love our neighbor, which is working together to care for others as we. Paul may have been suggesting to those Corinthians that they needed to spend a little less time on the I side of things, perhaps, and come back closer to the we end of things. And we've seen similar things today. Haven't we seen people who claim the priority of their own knowledge and freedom to not follow the rules about trying to keep COVID-19 from spreading, for example? And my question is, can't we do both? Can't we recognize the importance of our individual freedom, but then make the intentional choice to challenge ourselves to take the more difficult road for the benefit of others? Grove Church, for example, enjoys the benefits of the separation of church and state. So we are not bound by the dictates of the governor's office regarding COVID-19. However, we have, with much thought, decided to limit access to our building in the sanctuary as a way of caring for the health and safety and loving our faith community, choosing to follow Wesley's number one rule of do no harm. Now, all that superior knowledge that the members of the church in Corinth had, that wasn't a bad thing. That was actually good that they understood that the one God was what was important and that idols were nothing. The problem was what they did with their knowledge, using it to puff themselves up as opposed to caring for others. So similarly, we could benefit by increasing our spiritual knowledge, as long as what we gain from that is used to deepen our relationship with God and our neighbors. And so Grove's Faith Formation Initiative has instituted classes that we can take. There's one in between both of our worship services on Sunday morning, and there's other study opportunities during the week. The chance to think about our faith and be challenged by new and different ideas that can make us work through what it is we actually believe can be very valuable in deepening our relationship with God. At least that's what I found in my life. Pastor Lynn read a portion of Psalm 111 this morning, and that passage includes a reminder. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All who practice it have a good understanding." Now, I should point out that fear of the Lord business isn't about being afraid of God. It's more about having an attitude of awe and reverence, understanding our place in this whole universe, and recognizing that God is so far beyond our little piece of our world. It's in that state that we are best able to recognize, accept, and rejoice in God's love for us. And we can use that knowledge to then better be able to love God and all of our neighbors. Now, it's interesting that Grove's faith formation classes are categorized as to level of spiritual development, from acorn all the way to full-grown oak tree. So we can pick what classes we think might fit us best. And as Pastor Gary reminded us a few weeks ago, oaks and acorns all share the same DNA, right? We're just at different levels of spiritual development. It's kind of like the members of that church in Corinth. We had the more established members who had all this great knowledge, and we had the newbies in the faith. And one wasn't more important than the other. And we need to remember that oaks and acorns are equally important, and everybody in between, because for a healthy faith community, we need a full range of spiritual development. Now, here's a question I may throw out here. While those of us who are acorns might say that, yeah, we could probably learn a thing or two from those oaks over there, can those of us who are more oakish be open to the possibility of learning from the acorns? I hope so. Because acorns have a tendency to ask a whole lot of really interesting questions that can challenge us. These may be questions we haven't thought about. And they also feel free to share their doubts about their faith. And the combination of their questions and their doubts can help us be inspired to learn more about our faith. Ask any parent whether they've ever learned anything from their children based on their different perspective of the world. We've seen it here. When children were here for our children's time in worship, some of the responses that they would give to Pastor Eva would be pretty amazing. I mean, those of us sitting up here would sometimes just look at each other and think, okay, that was a pretty good sermon. We can all go home now. In this business of learning from people that we think don't know as much as we do, doesn't just pertain to children. We're fortunate here at Grove that most of us seem to get along pretty well. And that's a good thing. But consider our society as a whole. There are really deep divisions out there. Do we ever think that someone on the other side of an issue from us doesn't really understand the issue as well as we do? Doesn't matter what side we're on, okay? Do we ever think that? Would we be able to actually listen carefully to someone on the other side of an issue in hopes of learning something from them so that we might be able to better love them and grow in our faith together? We all share the same DNA, after all, right? We're all beloved sons and daughters of God. Well, this isn't necessarily going to be easy. This whole Christianity thing isn't always a walk in the park, you know? This can be quite a challenge. And it may involve having to look a lot deeper than the words and actions that people on that other side might share with us that make us want to kind of just turn around and walk the other way. Would we be able to hang in there and listen to people and learn from them and learn of them to better love them and grow in our faith? My hope for all of us is that we would not just love knowledge, but that we would be able to use the knowledge of the great love God has for each of us to enable us to listen to and be better at loving both God and all of